treachery and success of the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941, wasn't the only bad news Americans had to process.
Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island.
3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. In an instant, the hope of avoiding war, held so fervently in so many American hearts, was pulverized by a coordinated, multi-front onslaught that had been years in the planning.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
In December of 1941, Dick Cole was a young second lieutenant in the Army Air Corp Reserves, assigned to the 17th Bomb Group at Pendleton, Oregon. On Friday, the 5th of December, he had flown to March Field near Riverside, California on a 3-day pass.
We're given what they used to call an open post, where you get like a 3-day pass. We were in Hollywood at the time the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. On getting the notice that that had taken place, we immediately reported back to March Field and took off and went back to Pendleton. And from Pendleton, they divided the group up, and we went on submarine patrol, flying out of Seattle, Portland, Everett, Washington. And we did that until about first or second week in February.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
In December of 1941, Dick Cole was a young second lieutenant in the Army Air Corp Reserves, assigned to the 17th Bomb Group at Pendleton, Oregon. On Friday, the 5th of December, he had flown to March Field near Riverside, California on a 3-day pass.
We're given what they used to call an open post, where you get like a 3-day pass. We were in Hollywood at the time the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. On getting the notice that that had taken place, we immediately reported back to March Field and took off and went back to Pendleton. And from Pendleton, they divided the group up, and we went on submarine patrol, flying out of Seattle, Portland, Everett, Washington. And we did that until about first or second week in February.
While Tom Griffin was majoring in political science at the University of Alabama, he went through the ROTC program. After graduation, he spent a year with an anti-aircraft unit based at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. In 1940, he transferred to the Army Air Corps and was trained in celestial navigation. In January of 1941, he too was assigned to Camp Pendleton, Oregon.
They didn't have room for the officers out at the field at Pendleton, so we went into town and the townspeople rented bedrooms to quite a number of the Air Force officers. And somebody came in about 3:30 in the afternoon and came rushing in the room and said, "Isn't it awful?" And we said, "What do you mean awful?" And they told us about this attack on Pearl Harbor. That's the first we knew of it. It's an odd thing. That night, we went downtown and went to a movie theater. There was a movie on we wanted to see. And while we were watching it, they stopped the movie and a man came up on the stage and said, "All airmen from the field are ordered to report to the field immediately." But we got up and departed and went back out to the field, where our colonel gave us a little pep talk about what had happened and what was going to be expected of us, that sort of thing. So that was my Pearl Harbor day.
After graduating from Spring Lake High School in Earth, Texas in 1937 and completing 3 years of college, Robert Hite enlisted as an aviation cadet at Lubbock, Texas on September 9, 1940. He got his pilot's wings on May 29, 1941. He too was assigned to the 17th Bomb Group at Pendleton when Pearl Harbor was attacked. David Thatcher was 19 years old when he went from his father's dairy farm in Billings, Montana, to Missoula to enlist in the U.S. Army because he wanted to get away from dairy for a while. He was in airplane mechanics school in Lincoln, Nebraska on December 7th, 1941.
There was 20 picked from the 17th group, 5 from each of the 4 squadrons that went there to go to airplane mechanics school. So some of us were in the movie then. That was Sunday, so when they came out of the movie in the afternoon, we heard it had been bombed. No one expected something like that.
The December 7th, 1941 was a Sunday. And Sundays in flying school, when I was in advanced flying training at Victoria, Texas, 3 or 4 of us decided to go downtown Victoria and have lunch down there instead of eating in the mess hall. The base we were on was brand new. We had the BOQs were primitive, and the mess hall was not in good shape, and so we took the chance to go and get a nice lunch downtown. Well, one of the fellas had a car, and we were allowed to have them by that time in our training. If you were about to graduate, you could buy a car if you had the money to do it. And he had a radio in it, which I'd never seen before in an automobile. And we were riding around, getting back to the base, and the thing said that there was something had happened in Hawaii. And we just shrugged our shoulders. We didn't know what it was. And we really didn't know much about Hawaii.
C.V. Glines had been the official historian of the Doolittle Raider Association since 1972. He has authored 3 books on the raid, and assisted Jimmy Doolittle in writing his autobiography. He was also a World War II Army Air Corps pilot.
Next morning, on Monday morning, and we all went to the base for our flying training, and always there was a notice for each of our flights as to what the flying was going to be today. And the instructor had formation flying, gunnery, and he said in big letters he had written on the bottom of it, "There's a war on, get on the ball, follow me." Well, that's, that was about the norm. That was the announcement that we got, that there was a war on. We were on wartime. Well, our job was to follow him, and that's what we did. That day we went down to the gunnery range, we did our gunnery, and then instead of coming back to Victoria, he headed out to the Caribbean. And while I was sitting there flying my formation, it was 6-ship formation, and I wondered why we're going out of the Gulf here. We're not supposed to go into the Gulf. We don't have life jackets or anything. We followed him briefly, of course, and he finally made a turn and went back to Victoria. When we got on the ground, one of them had the nerve to ask us, "Sir, were we lost after gunnery at Matagorda Island?" And he said, "We were supposed to look for submarines." And he went, and that, I think we thought he was kidding. And we really didn't understand what was going on. But we kept on with our training. That's all we were supposed to do.
In his now memorialized speech to Congress on December 8, 1941, asking for a declaration of war, Franklin D. Roosevelt called the attack on Pearl Harbor unprovoked and dastardly. In Congress, only Montana Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin, the first woman to be elected to the United States House of Representatives, voted against entry into World War II.
Well, I was born and raised in Blue Island, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. Went to, grade school, high school there, and had a pretty normal childhood, I guess. I think I was happy I was a kid then than being a kid now, because I think life was a little more uncomplicated. When I graduated from high school, I was only 16 years old. I had started when I was 5, and I skipped 3rd grade. Well, I thought, I really can't go out and get a job. And a bunch of my school chums had said, well, why don't we join the National Guard? And there's a National Guard unit, 124th Field Artillery, on the south side of Chicago, and we'll join the Guard. And then we know what we'll be in. They're not just going to put us in the infantry or whatever. We figured we're just going to have to serve a year, and then we'd get out and have our year done. Well, that was all fine and dandy, except Pearl Harbor came along.
Well, my Uncle Jack and I have talked about some of his World War II experiences from time to time over the years, and I always thought that he was on a B-29, and he'd always correct me. Finally, I got it right, that he was on a B-17 in World War II.
The whole world benefited from this extraordinary generation of Uncle Jacks. Their life arc includes overcoming the Great Depression, fighting and winning the biggest, deadliest war in human history, and creating an age of economic prosperity and technological advancement which may never be equaled. Yet, they rarely talk about any of it. To me, he's always been just my Uncle Jack. It wasn't until I became active in veterans' causes that I really started thinking about what he'd done, what he'd been through.
And I think my first mission was into France. And it's like being at a movie. I mean, you're so new to all this, and you know, plane takes off, and you get in your group, and next thing you know, you're going over the English coast, and now you're going over the French coast, and you see a little flak over here, and I'd say for about the first 5 missions, it's just like, well, boy, isn't this something? Nothing's happened to you yet, and you see some planes get shot down, but it doesn't sink in yet. Well, we went to Leipzig. Now, it always kind of amazed me every time I saw this. As far as you could see in front of you, there were airplanes. As far as you could see back of you, there were airplanes. So we're on the bomb run, and we get hit. The one engine goes out, and with that, we lose a little power, and I'm in the lead ship, and we start to go down a little bit. Well, then the group follows us. So we go to the secondary. They're still following us. And we're trying to maintain altitude, but we just barely got to this airfield, and we dropped our bombs. But now we lost another engine. And about that time, the gas starts streaming out from under the wing, just a big stream. Well, we knew we were in trouble then. Well, so the group, they just keep on flying. They're going back. We're all by ourselves. And we said, well, we'll just keep going. And we'll go back as far as we can. If we have to bail out, or if the plane catches on fire, well, then we'll bail out. So we just kept going and going. We kept going down, just slowly. Now we only got about 2.5 engines because the other ones weren't working. And we just kept going and going. And pretty soon we pick up some fighters, a couple of P-38s that looked very nice sitting out here like that. Then we picked up some P-47s, and they, pick us up along the way. So that was kind of nice because we're all by ourselves. So we finally get to the coast, but this time we're down about 700 feet. And we didn't know whether we're going to have to ditch or what. So we knew, and we're practically out of gas. So we did land in England at a RAF base. We did get that. We got back that far, and so they came and got us then. But the plane was pretty well shot up.
After doing his duty and surviving the war, like millions of other veterans, Jack settled back into life in his hometown. He went to college and earned a degree from Northwestern University. He married a hometown girl and raised 4 children. They remained married for 50 years until her recent passing. He went to work for the hometown bank and remained there for 32 years.
I like what you're doing, is to preserve this, because it's true. Otherwise, it's just like some of the things I'm going to show you. They get put in the trunk and forgotten.
Not if we can help it, Uncle Jack. Not if we can help it.
Welcome to Scott's Warbird Alley. You thought you were going to see the B-17 show, didn't you? Well, guess what, you are. We looked all over the field for a B-17. The one we had planned to use is stuck in the mud down here. We call this sloshkosh now. But anyway, we're going to make do with this beautiful P-51 I thought it was appropriate to use the P-51 since the B-17s and the P-51s served together in the 8th Air Force in World War II. I'd like to introduce my guest today. Right here to my right is Uncle Jack Sinise. You recognize that name? Uncle Jack Sinise, Gary Sinise, one of our country's greatest actors. This is his uncle. And next to Uncle Jack was also another B-17 navigator, Don Casey. Don, pleasure to have you up here, sir. This wonderful book here was written by Don Casey. It's called To Fight for My Country, Sir. And it's about being a B-17 navigator in World War II, which both of these gentlemen were. They served in the same group, and they're going to talk about their training experiences on the B-17, and we're going to talk about that airplane, that wonderful airplane, of which this is the 75th anniversary of the B-17. It was designed in 1935. And I'm sorry we don't have one here to look at, but we're going to talk about that a little bit. Don, let me start with you. Let's talk about training, navigator training back in the 40s.
Well, 1943, when Jack and I started training, we were not together then and didn't know each other then. But we went through the aviation cadet program, which was moving at a very fast pace at that time because the 8th Air Force, which was primarily engaged in battle over Europe, was suffering horrendous losses due to the fact that they were not escorted by the P-51 fighters, which didn't exist at that time. In 43, 2 missions were flown, for example, to Schweinfurt, Germany, unescorted. And one was in August and one was in October. On each one of those missions, 60 B-17s were shot down with crews of 10 apiece, or 600, and the loss was 20% on those 2 occasions. Well, you can't keep up flying on a 20% loss ratio. You got 5 missions, you're gone. That was the experience of flying without fighter escort. But Jack and I got there from training. We both joined the 379th Bomb Group at Kimbolton, England, in the Midlands, and we did some more training there and started flying.
Jack, when you started your navigator training and you finished up and actually got your wings, did they pair you with other crew members at that time?
Well, what they did after you graduated, then you were assigned to a crew.
Wait a minute, we have a mic problem. Try this one.
Yeah. After we graduated, you were assigned to a crew, and of course, the first thing you heard was, "Well, don't get sent to Pio, Texas." We trained in San Marcos, Texas, which is near Austin, but they say don't get sent to Pio, Texas, because it's nothing out there. All it is sky, horizon, and desert, and rattlesnakes. Well, that didn't sound like the kind of place you wanted to go to, but naturally, when you looked on the board, there it was, Pio, Texas, for both of us. So when we got to Pio, why, we were assigned to a crew, and that's where you first met your pilot, co-pilot, and the gunners, and so forth. So, and then at that time, we started to fly around and get used to each other, and we didn't, as I say, we didn't do any bombing or anything like that, but we just, the pilots, you figure the pilot was new, the co-pilot's new, so you have to kind of get together and get to know each other. So that's how we started, at Pio, Texas. And then we did go, from that point, after a month or so, we went to Dyersburg, Tennessee, and did some more training. Not a whole lot, but that was our first real altitude mission at that time, which on our first flight we didn't make. We got up so far, and one of the engines started to go out, so we had to land at Stuttgart, Arkansas, and spend a couple days there while they put the plane back together again. But we did finally get through Dyersburg, and the next thing we're then shipped up to Kearney, Nebraska, and this was right after the first of the year. Nebraska gets a few blizzards and that type of thing, and the next thing you know, why they say, well, you're going to be leaving here soon, and you're going to be given a brand new B-17, and you're going to fly it over to England. Well, that seemed, well, a little impossible that we're going to do all that, but I remember calling back home, telling my folks, we're going to be leaving pretty soon, and if we can, we'll fly over the house, because I lived in the south suburb of Chicago at the time. Well, the only problem was that we didn't fly over my hometown of Blue Island. We flew over Joliet, Illinois at 3 o'clock in the morning, and there wasn't anybody out there waving towels and the rest of it. But when I mentioned it to my mother sometime later, and she said, oh, well, there was B-17s flying over, and we'd run out there and wave towels and so forth. Well, I said, well, the only thing is you didn't wave at us. But we did fly on from there. Our pilot, Steve King, he came from Akron, Ohio, and we got to Akron pretty much just after dawn, and we did fly over his house. That was one of the things. Should I take it from there? Well, from there we went up to Maine, and finally ended up at Goose Bay, Labrador, where the snow was so high. I mean, the runways were just tunneled more or less right through the snow drifts, and the snow was actually over the plane by as far as being cut out where the runways were. And the next thing we're getting a briefing. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but we're getting a briefing of how we're going to fly from there to Iceland, to Scotland, and end up dropping off the plane there. So we took off at night, and really you couldn't see the stars or anything like that. You just had a flight plan that they had put together based on what they knew as far as the winds and the conditions and so forth. I remember one thing they said, don't get too close to Greenland because the mountains are kind of high. And the one thing about Greenland, they had a radio beam that was directed directly south of Greenland. And at least when you went by that, you got one more or less one fix that you knew at least, well, I'm that far. After that, you were on your own flying over the Atlantic. So we ended up finally landing in Iceland, and we were there a couple days, and then flew to Prestwick, Scotland, dropped off the plane. Well, then I'll let you take it from there. Then.
Don, you were a 19-year-old navigator. Had you ever been out of the country?
No, I'd been to Canada maybe, but that was about it. Cuba when I was 2 years old, but not out of the country to speak of. And I wanted to go back to Iceland for a minute. When we landed there, we were in a different plane, of course, and we landed and we went in to have a drink at the officers' club, and we spent the night there. I met a Red Cross nurse, very lovely lady, who said, "Oh, your name is Casey." Well, there was a fellow named Casey who through here not too long ago, and he said he was going to be the hottest B-17 pilot in the 8th Air Force. Well, he wound up in the next room to me in Germany when I finally got there. The thing I remember about going to our new group, and Jack and I, again, were in different crews, but the navigators got no respect. We were the Rodney Dangerfields of the air crew. We didn't do anything. You couldn't see what we were doing. And all we did was get them there and get them back, wherever it was. So it was a mystery what the navigators did, and most people thought, well, nothing much. And then if you're flying in a formation, as we flew in formations of 20 to 30 planes, depending on how many were available that particular day on a mission. so that if you were back in the formation, you were, as a navigator, merely keeping track of where you were. The lead navigator was guiding to where you were going to go, and we all followed the leader in tight formation. Keep in mind, I'm 19, Jack is 20, and we had a colonel who was a West Pointer named Maurice Preston, and I don't think he could ever get over the idea that 19-year-old kids could come over there ranked as second lieutenants after he had taken 4 years of West Point to become a lieutenant, and all of a sudden here we are, Army of the United States. Well, as far as I was concerned, he didn't think anything of us at all. I had the chance to show him what we could do, though, one day, and that was flying a mission. I think it was my 24th, and we were told to fly down to another base, get out of our plane, and do what they told us. Well, they don't tell the navigator anything, you know. So I got out, I got in this plane, and pretty soon a colonel came on board and sat in the co-pilot seat, and 2 bombardiers came on board. This was June the 12th of 1944, 6 days after the invasion. We were bombing an airfield behind the invasion lines. Well, I'm sitting there waiting for somebody to tell me what I'm supposed to do. All of a sudden, we're taking off. The plane is taking off. And I say, I must be the navigator. Well, Jack had been to a 2-week training course for lead navigators. I had never gotten any idea of that, so I didn't know what to do except to just navigate. Fortunately, it was only a 100-mile trip, but we flew in over the invasion front, and we dropped our bombs, and we got back to England and came back to our own base. On arrival at the base, they said, "We want to talk to you. Come into the office, please. You know, you were not supposed to do that. That was a mistake." I mean, how could that be? A mistake? Because it was a case of mistaken identity. The other group thought I was a trained lead navigator, and I didn't know what I was doing there, so I went out and flew the mission. But they said, we're gonna promote you. You've done the job now, so you're a lead navigator, but we're going to put you on a deputy lead ship. Oh, and what is the deputy lead? Oh, you'll love that. It happens to be the hottest. They didn't say this. They kept it all a secret. It happens to be the hottest spot in the formation because all the guns on the ground are aiming at the lead ship. And we had already lost 3 deputy lead planes. Not a lead ship, but 3 deputy lead planes. So I thought, well, this sounds great. I wrote home to the folks, and I'm just being promoted to deputy leader. Well, 2 missions on deputy lead, and we're hit and shot down. Now, that shoot-down experience is unique. And what you don't think about is that what do you do when your plane is on fire and the pilot says bail out? And you have not practiced any of that. You don't know what to do. You don't know anything about where you are, except the target was Hamburg, Germany that day. The previous August, the British and Americans had flown 3 nights and days and bombed Hamburg so badly that 75,000 civilians were killed or made homeless. So, unbeknownst to us, Hamburg was the worst place you could pick to get shot down. They had distinct memories of what it was like to be bombed the way we had bombed them, and the civilians were told by Adolf Hitler, it's all right to take your revenge on the flyers that are parachuting out of the planes. And Hitler further ordered that the troops should not interfere with the civilians taking their revenge on us. Well, as a result, 2 of our guys were beaten to death on the ground. 1 was shot in his parachute. 1 more was killed when the plane blew up. 2 more had ropes around their neck and were rescued by the soldiers. I had a unique experience, as everyone was. You don't all land together. You're scattered all over the countryside. And I landed in a little suburban area right across from a military hospital in which the wounded German soldiers are hanging out the window watching me come down in my my big white umbrella. And so what did I do when I landed? The memory was, hide your parachute. So I hid my parachute. They're watching me across the street.
Jack?
And I'll cut this short, but I was rescued by 2 German soldiers with guns, and we had been told, you have a .45 automatic, you can carry that if you want to, but we don't recommend it because the Germans can shoot you just because you have a gun and say, well, he tried to pull a gun on me, so he shot him. So I didn't carry a gun. I put my hands up, and the war was over for me. They took me to an air raid shelter for a brief time. I sat amongst the German civilians while the rest of the raid was going on. And then they took me to a camp compound in Hamburg where I recognized the name over the stockade. And in a book I had read in the previous high school, I'm only 19, so back when I was 17, I read this book about this prison camp at Fuhlsbüttel in Hamburg where they beat and tortured the prisoners. Well, it turned out that this was not the same prison, but from there they took us to the Great Escape Camp. I'll pass the mic over to Jack.
Jack, let's talk about the crew members that you met. You guys are all young, 18 to 22 years old for the most part. And you didn't really want to make friends because they were losing so many people. You touched on that. I think in '42, when the 8th Air Force went into England, every time they went on a mission, they lose about 1/3. So you didn't want to make friends.
1943 is when.
Yeah.
Well, the thing with it is that you train with your crew when you get over there, and the way the mission started out, you're going to go on your first mission now after we did some practicing around England, and so you don't know what's going to happen. And when I was asked about it before, we flew into France, and so the first time that you see the flag starting to come up, well, that's gee, look at that, these little bursts around, and then you're looking over and you see a plane get hit, and that goes down. But it was like a movie. It wasn't happening to you. It's just you were out there watching this thing. I think it took about 5 missions before you suddenly realized that somebody was shooting at you, and that one of those that you were watching could be you. But initially, I wasn't really scared. I just, because you don't know what's going to happen, and it just seemed like, well, that's nice, and look at that. Well, that guy blew up, and here come the shoots, and all this business. But after the 5th mission, you kind of begin to think about, wait a minute, this, they're not playing games down there, and so it began to, at least you thought about it. So when I started out, I just was the regular navigator. But when I became a lead navigator, because you're in the lead ship, there were certain things you had to do. The busiest time was from the time that you started on the bomb run till that was over. So, but that was also the kind of the roughest time, because by that time, they know they've got the flak gun zeroed in on you. They know where your altitude is and so forth, and kind of all hell is breaking loose around you. But you are so busy that because you have to check with the bombardier, and you had to, the plane went on autopilot through the bomb site, and one of the things you had to do was to look at this indices that comes down on the bomb site and count out how many inches it is from the middle point, because that would tell the pilot how far away he was from taking over the control of the plane. When that indices got down to the middle, then the bombs dropped. But they wanted him to know just how much longer he had to wait before he took control of the plane. After the bombs are dropped, pilot took over, and you'd make your turn and get out of there. But actually, maybe it was good that you were busy at that time, because you didn't really have time to think about what's going on. But that was the busiest time, and after you made your turn, and you you start on home. Well, then it kind of let down a little bit. When you got back home, you went to the briefing because they wanted to see what you had to say. And one thing I remember is I was 20 years old then. I wasn't really drinking by that time, but one of the things they did, take you in the briefing room, and right in the middle of the table was a bottle of old Overholt rye whiskey. And everybody had to have a couple of shots of that. Because you've been flying for 6-7 hours, you haven't eaten, and that was supposed to relax you. Well, it did, pretty good. But that was kind of my first experience in having a hard drink. Because when I graduated from high school, at that time, in my senior class, I don't know of anybody that smoked. I don't know anybody that drank. They did go out with girls, I do remember that. But it was a little different time. And it took a while before maybe you might start having a little extra beer or something like that. But I always just remember the first time taking a shot of that old Overholt. I never forgot it. But that would relax you. So, well.
One of my favorite movies of all time was The Great Escape with Steve McQueen and James Garner. Just a great movie. I'm sure you all agree, right? Well, Don was there. He was in The Great Escape prison, Stalag Luft 3. And in his book here, he talks about the differences in the movie and the actual happenings. So, and now I'd like Don to talk about that.
Well, thank you. When I wrote the book originally, I poo-pooed what Steve McQueen had done in the movie because I thought it never happened. Well, I had a book at home written by the fellow whose character Steve McQueen played. His name was Jerry Sage. He had an unusual story himself. He was captured in Africa. He was an OSS man, which was a forerunner to the CIA. Sage actually did all of the things that Steve McQueen did, including throwing his baseball over the little guardrail and then walking in where you were liable to be shot immediately if you did so. I had to rewrite that part because I found that all the things that Steve did, except the motorcycle ride, which was not a feature of the actual story, was actually done by this fellow Sage, and I recanted and rewrote it so that it reflected credit on him. The thing about the prison camp was that the Great Escape Camp was in western Poland. There were 10,000 flying officers in that one camp, Allied flying officers. How many planes do you think they had to shoot down to get that number? Plus, there were other camps with flying officers. Well, General Bub Clark wrote, and I knew him in the prison camp, he was a colonel then, that there were 10,000 bombers shot down, of our bombers, and 8,000 fighters. Now, I can't authenticate that for you, but that would show you the type of losses we were suffering. And even though the percentages got better flying, so well, your chances of getting to 28 missions were fair, but in the early days of 1943, as I found out from talking to prisoners of war who had been shot down in that period of time, the number of missions was less than 5 before they were shot down, some on their first mission, because they were flying without escorts. The prisoner of war camp was an experience I'll never forget. I have to say that the reason I'm dressed the way I am today is because I still have the mental state of a prisoner who said, never again am I going to be like an animal behind the barbed wire, starving, and being just living a terrible existence. We were lucky that we did survive, but we had some terrible moments that next winter of January 1945. The Russians were within 20 miles of our camp. We could hear their cannons going off. And so we knew that something was going to happen. unbeknownst to us, Hitler had ordered we all be marched out of there, which we were, at 15 degrees below zero in a blizzard with everything we owned on our backs. And we marched, I think, 35 miles the first night without stopping, except for we had a little rest period there. And we then marched to a little town called Moscow. We're going west from the camp because the Russians were coming from the east. And we managed to get inside a factory where there was heat. And we were able to take our clothes off for a change and get some relief from the cold. From there, a day and a half later, they marched us out, and we went another 10 miles in the cold weather and boarded cattle cars that were built to hold 40 men or 8 horses. One, couldn't have both, but a lot of people think that's what it was. They put 50 of us in each one of these cars, and there wasn't room for everybody to sit down at once. At one point, we pulled into Regensburg. I know now what it was. I didn't know then. And the air raid sirens went off. And the German guards locked us in and left. And we didn't know what the target was. Maybe we were sitting in this marshalling yard. Maybe we were the target. We had no knowledge of whether there was any signs. And it was nighttime anyway, so what are you going to do? We waited. They heard the planes flying over. We heard the bombs dropping in the distance. And then we moved on again from there. That was an experience that you don't want to live through, where you're locked in a cage and you hear an air raid siren go off. We went on from there on the train to Bavaria, to a camp called Stalag 7A. Now, this camp was built for 40,000 prisoners. When we got there were already 100,000. We added another 10,000. By the time we were liberated, it was 130,000. Conditions there were deplorable. It was the worst. We had fleas. We were starving. We lost weight. I think I got down to about 120 pounds. And finally, Patton's Army, on April 29th, 1945, I'll never forget that day as long as I live. The gunfire going on outside of camp. We heard cannon fire. And Patton's 14th Armored Division overran our camp. The Germans fled. We were in shock, most of us. I was in particular, because you don't actually realize, say, how can this be? We're free to go. Patton came into our camp 3 days later, May 2nd, and we stood at attention in our rags, in our awful condition. He said 5 words to us: "Have you enough to eat?" Well, that wasn't the point, really. It was what we could eat, not if we had enough to eat. And our stomachs were in such condition, we could not eat regular food. I actually went one day, walked down to a mess kitchen run by our Army, and they offered us food. We couldn't eat it. Went back to camp and waited for the people to come and get us. Patton, I had my impression of Patton at the time. He had a scowl on his face. And I thought, well, why is he scowling? We're happy, we're liberated. And I read finally in his diary, he said, what a fine bunch of men. But then I read a speech last year that he gave to his troops before the invasion, and in that speech he said to his own men, "My men don't surrender. And I don't want to hear about any of you being captured unless you were wounded, and even then I expect you to keep on fighting." So I formed the opinion, as I said originally, that Patton was kind of disdainful of prisoners of war because we must have screwed up or we wouldn't be there. But I forgave him. He was a great general and a great character, and he'd set us free. That was the end of that experience. But I have to say that every prisoner of war who's been to prison for any length of time comes away with post-traumatic stress disorder. I believe that Senator McCain, if he'll forgive me, I believe he's still suffering from his prison imprisonment. We had these thousands of men there in those conditions. It had to affect you. And so when I read now about the post-traumatic stress disorder and the troops coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, I believe every bit of it, because in that war, like our war, the shooting came from every direction. You didn't know where it was coming from. You don't know what's coming next. You don't know who the enemy over there is. And that our men are legitimately affected by that. So I express sympathy for them, and I recommend that you consider that too when you read about them. Their war is terrible over there, and they're suffering for it. But I'm proud of my experience. I'm proud to be here. And when I raised my 4 sons, I used to tell them they'd have something for dinner that they didn't particularly like broccoli or something like that. And so I said, well, learn to enjoy that food, because someday you might be in a place where that's all there is to eat. And while the other people are making up their mind whether they're going to eat it or not, you can be gorging yourself on this food that you've learned to eat. But I'm proud to be associated with Jack. Jack and I want to say that briefly, were navigators who nobody told anything, who never got any respect. We had trouble just keeping busy off when there was nothing doing. And Jack and I would go down to the link trainer. Anybody know what a link trainer is? Okay. A link trainer is a dummy plane that flies electrically on the ground, and it's not an aerial flying airplane. Jack and I would take turns getting in the pilot's seat, pull the hood over, and fly on the instruments. Well, we didn't know how to fly in the first place. So the voice would come over the microphone. You are now 200 feet below ground. Pull up. So what we did, those crazy things we did, were things that you did in combat to keep your wits about you. You couldn't think and dwell on what it was like to go on your next mission and where we're going next. You had to pretend that it didn't happen. If somebody got shot down, as I did, Jack told me later when I saw him after the war, he said I had to be philosophical about that. And, you know, maybe I expected more from Jack as such a buddy, but that's how we did it. You have to say, sorry, Joe, you're down. We miss you. We got to go on with our job.
He told me before we started, I said, what do you want to talk about? He said, I was a trial lawyer for 50 years, so I don't have to do much talking. But I'm looking at some serious medals here, guys. I don't know if you can see this or not, but I see Distinguished Flying Crosses. I see air medals with oak leaf clusters, and you proudly wear them, and rightfully so. Thank you so much for what you did for us.
Thank you.
I want to ask you this. We still got a few minutes here. What does being a B-17 crew member mean to you now? Do you keep up with your old buddies?
Well, they're all dying off. Jack and I are among the few that are left. My crew is all dead. So you became very close to those fellows because, for example, in the Navigator particularly, sat in the nose compartment of the B-17 with the bombardier, and we were there on takeoffs and landings. Well, the rules said get back in the back and go to the radio room and sit with your back against the wall. Well, we didn't pay any attention to that. We knew nothing was going to happen to us, and we did crazy things like that. Oh. Well, we shared this pilot. I flew only 2 missions with Steve King, and a couple of stories about Steve. He was recognized already before we got shot down as a real comer to be a leader in the group, and Steve had signed up for his second tour before he finished the first one. He was promised a promotion, he was promised a leadership role, and I think he had the toughest time when we got shot down because his eyes were on a career in the Army. But the story that Steve told most I remember was about his top gunner, Ray Wheeler. And Ray Wheeler had shot down 5 German fighters from his top turret. Steve went to Ray one time, and he said, you know, when that fighter came onto us, he was shot down. He said, what were you waiting for? And Ray said, well, I wanted them to get a little closer so I could make a sure kill. And Steve said, for God's sake, don't do that again. Shoot at him even if he's out of range. Don't try to scare him away. That was the kind of crews we had. They were guys that had tremendous guts, and they did what they were told to do, and they performed well.
For the last 17 years, it's been my privilege to be a crew member on the EA's B-17 aluminum overcast. And I've been all over this country, and I've heard thousands of these stories, and what a privilege it is to talk to these gentlemen and thank them for what they did. And right now, I'm going to ask all the veterans in the audience, would you please stand and be recognized? All the veterans, please. Now, all you people that are sitting down, you should turn to those veterans and thank them for your freedom. Over in the Warbird area, right over here in the gift shop, these gentlemen are going to be there in a few minutes signing autographs. And we want to encourage you to join the EA Warbirds of America, all of you. You don't have to be a pilot, just have an interest in the history and heritage of this country. Thank you so much for watching Warbirds in Review.